Hi everybody, and welcome to episode 55 of the Vassals of Kingsgrave epic linear reread of George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. This episode could potentially spoil any events in George R. R. Martin's published series, including TWOW preview chapters. We don't normally discuss the show Game of Thrones, but in this case we will be referring to the relevant episodes of Game of Thrones. So if you haven't seen any of it at all, as opposed to sort of stopping watching when the show and books diverged, you might also not want to listen to this particular episode. My name's Bina007. I'll be hosting this episode, and the stuff that we're going to be covering today is following on from the last episode where we had our first Dany chapter from A Dance with Dragons, very exciting, and Bran dreaming about the Red Wedding at the Night Fort. In this episode we see further fallout from both Red and Purple weddings. We've got the first half of Tyrion's trial in Tyrion 9 from A Storm of Swords. We then move to Jaime 7 and Arya 12. So these are the events from the 7th of January 300 AL to the 13th of January. The order of these chapters deserves a bit of a note, because I think a lot of us hosts who are going to be discussing these chapters were scratching our heads. The reason why we've got Tyrion before Jaime is that the Tyrion chapter covers a week, and there is a famous or infamous but anonymous Redditor who invented the linear timeline, and he starts the Tyrion chapter first because it starts the day before Jaime arrives back in King's Landing. So that's the reason why we've done them in that order, just following on from his Reddit post. Another thing that we wanted to say is that we've been having a lot of discussion amongst ourselves and on the forums of a podcast of Ice and Fire about the way in which to tackle the events in Jaime 7, because they're both controversial and very sensitive within the fandom. So I'm going to hand over to Casey with some thoughts about how we're going to try and approach this in this episode.
So this is Casey, Blue-Eyed Queen on the forums. In today's podcast, we will be discussing a scene between Jaime and Cersei, in which, in my and many others' opinion, is a rape scene, in which Jaime forces himself onto Cersei. Today, we cannot deny that no means no, and what Jaime did here is disturbing and, under most laws, rape. However, the scene is controversial, and not everyone, even the writer and show actors, agree on what occurs. We will be discussing this scene in the context of what is presented in the books, in the show, what George R. R. Martin has said on the scene, and our own personal perspectives. It will potentially be a difficult discussion, both for us to talk about and for listeners. While we want to be sensitive on this topic, we also want to have a literary and worldly discussion, which may include questioning what happens in this scene, our personal thoughts on reading the chapter now and when we first read it, and why this particular scene seems to be so debatable. Talking about the scene in this open of a way can be viewed as problematic, but I think it's important to be open in our opinions and also to be open in listening to altering opinions. If you would like to be part of this discussion, feel free to comment on the podcast thread on the Podcast of Ice and Fire forums. We would definitely want to hear those opinions. What we say represents the opinions of us individually and not the podcast as a whole.
Absolutely well said, Casey, and thanks for joining. That's Blue-Eyed Queen from the forums. We have other hosts, however. I want to say hi to Adam.
Yeah, hi, this is Adam, DrownedSnow on the forums.
We're also joined by Patrick.
Greetings, it is I, PatrickTheTall, Patrick in real life.
We're also joined by Nadia.
Hi everyone, this is Nadia.
And hopefully later we'll be joined by Michal if she can tear herself away from season 2 of Stranger Things, and also by Glen, DagosRivers on the forums when he updates his computer. So, as I said, we've got some big meaty chapters to cover today. The first one is going to be Tyrion 9. So, as I said before, this kicks off on the 7th of January 300 AL to the 13th, and it takes place in King's Landing, and here's Glen with the summary.
After Tyrion's capture and imprisonment, we visit a conversation between Kevan and Tyrion. Kevan informs Tyrion his trial begins in 3 days. He asks Tyrion to list the witnesses of his defence, yet Tyrion can only list one witness, Sansa. Tyrion considers trial by combat as he doubts he will be given a fair trial and desperately tries to seek Bronn, enlisting Podrick's help to request Bronn as his champion. However, Cersei plans to name Sir Gregor Clegane as her champion should Tyrion opt for trial by combat. Kevan visits Tyrion nightly and grows cold and distant towards Tyrion, certain of Tyrion's guilt. Eventually, Podrick delivers Bronn to Tyrion, but the stakes are too high for Bronn and doesn't see the profit were he to defeat Sir Gregor Clegane. Bronn explains Cersei has made a match for him with Lawless Stokeworth, which he would sabotage if he fights for Tyrion. The trial commences, and Cersei has several witnesses that Tyrion poisoned Joffrey, including the Kingsguard and many of the wedding guests and servants. Kevin offers the option of joining the watch to Tyrion. On the night of the second day of the trial, Tyrion is visited by one of his judges, Oberyn Martell. Oberyn confirms Mace Tyrell and Tyrion's father are certain of his guilt. However, Oberyn will help him, not as a judge, but as his champion.
Okay, would anyone like to kick off with their thoughts on this chapter?
I think it's really good. That's my first impression, really. It tells a lot about the situation, even and Tyrion needs like an update on all the things that are happening. But by doing that, by giving him the update, he's also giving us an update on how things are looking from Tyrion's perspective. So in that sense, I really like it. And it's also one of the last, chapters before Tyrion really loses it. So
Yeah.
I'm guessing I'm enjoying it while it's still sweet.
It's an enormous information dump, isn't it? I was even thinking how you summarize this without literally just going through every line of who testified and how. Amazingly well written and amazingly concise.
Oh yeah, there's a lot in that. But hey, the Viper, right? That's gonna end up well.
Did any of it surprise you? I mean, I remember when I first read it, definitely the coup de grace of the Viper offering to fight for him did surprise me. But I have to say, the Bronn thing surprised me too. And I read this before the show, and in the show it's much more of a pally relationship, and Bronn is kind of nicer in a way than he is in the books. But even then, even as mercenary as he is in the books, I really was surprised that he would want to marry Loras Stokeworth and give up on the Lannister gold. That really did shock me.
Well, this is the person who said he'd kill a baby if he was paid to do it. So I
True.
think he's willing to do anything. And this is basically the Lannisters rewarding him for, whatever he's doing right now. They're basically awarding him this noble woman so he can climb the next rung toward nobility.
Yeah, I did think it was deeply tragic when Tyrion is describing how desperate the Stokesworth are, and that they have to be truly desperate to want to marry a lowborn like Bronn. And then he adds they even wanted to marry her off to me. So that even though he's an aristo, incredibly rich son of a Lannister, he's kind of in that same category as Bronn because of his sort of being a dwarf. I just find that just the matter-of-fact way in which he dismisses himself and thinks, or the actual fact that society does dismiss him like that is really tragic.
But they would much rather Tyrion than Bronn. I mean, let's be honest. Just the whole Lannister aspect. But yeah,
Do you
I
think
it's
so?
part
Would they
of
rather
the way
Tyrion?
he views himself? I was just saying, for the long term of the household, it's because you have the Lannister connection, and they kind of take care of their own, and there's more prestige involved with that. So they suffer through Tyrion for however long he's alive, and they just kind of be over it. I think be their thinking.
After all, he is currently the heir to the West, I suppose.
Also, there's also the fact that they do distinguish between mixed born and children of like a joint lord and highborn people. So even if Tyrion is an imp, he's still highborn. So
yeah, and I mean, I guess
he would count for more.
As far as the namings go, Bronn, Stokeworth would keep the name, but would things if it was Tyrion, would everything transfer to Lannister? I don't know, because it seems like sometimes they do that where a male comes in and marries the female heir, and will sometimes carry that name on instead of their own name.
Yes, but that's why you get double barrel names as well in in real life aristo families. So the Spencer Churchills become that because the Spencers are actually the kind of more senior house, so the girl doesn't want to lose that. So they'd go double barrel rather than just becoming Churchills, for instance.
Yeah.
Right.
This is also the chapter where we get the really fascinating character news about Tywin and how his father was perceived as weak, and that hugely coloured how he ruled. And I found the sentence where they're talking about he gave the realm 20 years of good rule and peace and had no thanks but a jealous king. Very powerful. And I did wonder, was Tywin a good ruler? I mean, we've had discussions in the past about, is he not as clever as people think he is? I had this discussion with S.J. Lee in Toronto that we think Tywin's actually people overestimate his intelligence, but was he one of the best rulers of Westeros that we've seen so far, or implied rulers?
Well, when you say best rulers, do you mean most boring rulers? because that we have that discussion on Targaryen cast every time, and I usually argue for if nothing happens specifically and he's the reason for it, then it's kind of boring, right? But yeah, from the
But
whole
that, from the
perspective,
point of view of the sort of from the small folks' point of view, if you can just live a
Yeah.
good life unimpeded, then that's good. And even from an Aristo point of view, if you just want to sort of carry on, amass wealth, not lose siblings in wars, then stability and boredom is good, no?
yeah, I mean
Yeah, I mean,
that's definitely it.
for the good of the realm, it's better to have someone like that, isn't it? Even though,
Yeah.
like, for the songs and the history books, it's not as exciting. But it's like it's like in the NFL, you have the quarterback. We call them the game manager. He doesn't put up a lot of numbers or whatever. But it's like, oh, they won a Super Bowl. Like, isn't that better than the guy who puts up all the numbers but doesn't get the playoffs? Like, I don't know.
I'm sorry, that sports reference went just over my head. I don't understand that, but yeah. Basically, yeah, you're right. I mean, if you ask the Lord what you rather would have, unless they're like Targaryen or some sort of like Blackfire sympathizer or something like that, they would say it's better just to have a king or have a ruler that doesn't fuck things up, basically.
I think that there's a difference between being a great ruler and being a successful ruler. I feel like Tywin definitely meets the mark of successful, but like I feel like people define great as in like, not just security of their realm and wealth, but also like the kindness that the hierarchy gives back to the people. So I feel like in that sense, Tywin was like power, 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 and I feel like a lot of his people probably lived in fear because of that, especially with Castamere.
I'm not necessarily agreeing with you that kindness is a thing that needs to be in a great ruler. I mean, Aegon Targaryen wasn't necessarily very kind, so to say, but he's still counted as one of the best, right? Just because of his ability to conquer the realm, right? So I'm just saying that I guess. I would agree that Tywin is a successful ruler, and there is a difference there. I would say that the difference is that a successful ruler, secures his own time and his own during his own rule, and a great ruler secures the realm for generations to come, right?
I suppose he probably thought that he was, insofar as he married his daughter to the king and thought he would have influence through Joffrey to the next generation. I guess the difference to me is also partly motivation. Like, is he a good or great ruler if... I think the peace and security for the land, for the small folk and the aristos, was a kind of byproduct of him creating stability in which to amass further wealth and amass further power. Like, I don't think he sort of set out with a mission to make life better for everybody. I don't know, Michal, have you got any views? Sorry, Nadia.
We have to keep in mind that Tywin was ruling despite Aerys, right? Aerys was constantly trying to undermine his effort to do whatever he wanted to. So Tywin could have been a great ruler, but everything that he did, despite Aerys, he must have been pretty brilliant to manage to do everything, all of that. Even though all the lords that were trying to get Aerys to do something for them would put down Tywin constantly, and he was like working in a very hostile environment, and he still managed
to really good point.
Keep peace for 20 years.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Even more than that, like you have to, like his house was not anywhere near the level that it is when he leaves it. Right when he comes in, his father kind of let things go to ruin.
I'm surprised that actually Aerys let Tywin get rid of the reins like that on the Castameres.
But did he know, or did he just have to deal with it after the fact?
Or did he just let them handle their own stuff? Yeah.
I mean, as a totalitarian ruler as the Targaryens were, I would assume that he would at least be miffed with the prospect of not,
But that happened a long time ago. That was when Tywin was very young. His father was still alive, and I don't think Aerys was king at that time. I'm not sure about that, but they must have been very young.
Yeah.
And they used to be friends when they were younger.
Well, at least he used to go to court, right?
Yeah, Tyrion became Hand when he was 20, and this happened like a while before that.
Yeah, a few years at least.
So they must have been very young, and they were friends at that point. So
So it's like, man, bro, you sick, you sick, bro. I mean, I wouldn't want to be your enemy, right?
Yeah. Well, what does it say that everything kind of fell apart after Tywin left too? But I think we have there's two Tywins. There's Tywin as the hand under Aerys, and then like afterwards with Robert and marrying Cersei to Robert, and I don't know. It's two. He takes two very different roles.
Yeah,
I feel like he's just as harsh in both, but I don't know.
It was so funny though, because just as I was feeling softened towards Tywin, he then has that really brutal conversation with Jaime in the next chapter, which ends with him just dismissing him as a son. So, I don't know. Welcome, Michal. How are you? Do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Hi, I'm Michal. I'm Inkasrain on the forum.
Thank you for joining.
My pleasure.
Any view on this Mammoth Tyrion 9 chapter that covers a week?
Oh man, for me, my main thought with a lot of what happens to Tyrion in Storm is that all of the stuff that feels so good for us and for him in Clash, like his getting revenge on Cersei and his getting revenge on Pycelle and arranging things and all of that, like it's really amazing how all of those like I can remember specific points like during the trial when it's like in the book prior to this you're like, yes, go Tyrion, this is amazing, badass, and then it's like it comes back to bite him beyond what he could have imagined, I think. And it's a really interesting choice on George's part to have, like, I mean, I don't think it's not this Tyrion chapter, it's the next one where he goes like, I saved you all, but that's still like, I don't know. It's that feeling pervades of like Tyrion being the monster, kind of no matter what he does, and I don't know. It's tough because Tyrion's kind of a tough character, but like I'm in a position with Tyrion where I feel like desperately sorry for him, and I'm also like, you dug your own grave, dude.
It does make you reflect on those times when he made those public declarations in the past, doesn't it? I mean, even when you're in a chamber or in King's Landing and you start threatening your sister, and yes, you're very witty and your mouth runs away with you, but little birds are listening always, and you're smart. You should know this. I mean, he couldn't have predicted he was going to be up in front of a trial, and even at the start of this chapter, he says, stop being a smartass. This isn't going to help you. And it's like that lesson or that moral is what this whole chapter's about. Like he's won small victories, but he's going to lose the battle now.
There's also a line, also just like every time he has gone off on Joffrey, which is so satisfying just for everybody involved, it all is used against him. And it's the type of thing where like we all know he's innocent and we know this is bullshit, but like they have a decent argument, like with no apparent culprit, with the Tyrells having hidden their fingerprints so well. Like, I think the fact that Kevin is put in the position, who is, a problematic character of himself, but probably like one of the like white hat Lannisters as far as that goes, that Kevin is the one who's like, no, you clearly did this. I think that's a really interesting thing for us to look at. But Tyrion, do you guys know the theory about Tyrion losing his tongue?
No.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it comes from like the History of Westeros wing of the fandom, and with Euron Greyjoy on the loose in Winds of Winter and his penchant for taking people's tongues out. Tyrion has a direct line here, like that somebody should cut his tongue out or he should do it himself. And I've heard people connect the two, that Tyrion will at some point lose his tongue, which to me just seems like almost unbearable to think about, even as somebody has mixed feelings with Tyrion, but it would be kind of perfect in a George way.
There's something very elegant about it, isn't there? Sort of, exactly, Nadia. Jaime loses the hand, Tyrion loses the tongue.
The sword hand.
And what does Cersei lose?
Cersei loses her children and her sexuality, sort of.
Her sexuality, I think. Her attractiveness to men. That would be equivalent. That's really elegant. I like that. I hope it doesn't happen though, because the books will be a lot more boring. And after dance, we need some comedy lines.
How does Tyrion not go insane though? Like if his tongue gets cut out, like I don't see him like rising up from that the way Jaime does with his hand. Understand, like they're different things, obviously.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He's already like kind of depressed Tyrion, and like he'd just be done.
I was going to ask, do you not think he's already turning slightly insane? I mean, we're going to talk about sexual violence in the next chapter, but there are things that he does in dance which are incredibly
that is
dodgy.
Less disputable, I guess.
Well, it depends on what you think about this one, but yeah, definitely that's very, very worrying.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I kind of think that Tyrion. I feel like Tyrion's kind of gonna be or he's going down this path where he's, we first meet him, and he's this quote unquote good character. He doesn't really have too much bad going on from what we mostly feel sympathy for him. But I feel like as time goes on, I feel like there's not going to be any turnaround for him, which I think might disappoint a lot of readers of Winds and Dance potentially, if that's what ends up happening. But I feel like he does all this good, and then to have all this stuff happen to him, and especially seeing this dark route of him in Dance, which made me personally I really liked him in the show, and that's where I was first introduced. But also in the books, the first three, you're just go Tyrion, this is great. And then you get book 5, and you're like, oh no, I don't like you anymore.
Well, arguably the same with Arya, right? I mean, I think it's very similar.
Yeah, but Tyrion, I think, Tyrion, you can make the argument that you never should have liked Tyrion, I think. Arya is a child. And
yeah, also he's an adult, right? So he has to take ownership of what he does, whereas she's a brutalized child.
Yeah.
So it's not
I think Martin
and I take it back.
crafts the story for us to like Tyrion. I mean, right? I mean, how many times has he stated that Tyrion's his favorite character? I think we're meant to like him, especially early on.
But isn't it also an effect of him being a point of view character? I mean, he automatically gets some points there.
A lot of people don't like Sansa, and she's a point of view character.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's true.
But we didn't have her for quite a while. We did have Arya to see Sansa through, and that kind of soured us on her, right?
I guess there's less that people blame Tyrion for. They feel like he gets blamed unfairly, and the fandom seems to think that Sansa is responsible for a lot of things that she's not really responsible for.
Well, Tyrion does too. I was going to bring that up. He has that line oh, she wasted no time proving how much those vows meant to her, did she?
He still does have this bizarre sort of marital loyalty that I'm not going to throw her under a bus.
Yeah, no, it's a weird, I'm not completely crapping on Tyrion for this. I think he does have very, very complicated feelings towards Sansa. But I feel like some of that complication is really dark and comes from it's a lot of it is perfectly reasonable, but I think that he and Sansa both had vastly different, Tyrion thought that this was for the long haul, I think, even if he didn't allow himself to think that. Sansa was looking for an out the whole time, and she thought she had one. She did have one. Tyrion, I think, at some point expected her to fall in love with him, and because I mean that's what Tyrion expects from everyone. That's Tyrion's,
and he needs love as well. I mean
that's why I can't hate Tyrion. That's
he
why
just didn't have a lot of time, Michal. I mean, come on.
But he didn't, right? And I do truly believe that Sansa's kind of she's kind enough and she's bright enough that if she had been with him for long enough, they might have learnt to love each other. But yeah, it was doomed.
Of any of the kind of forced bad relationships in this world, the two of them maybe could have actually come to an agreement.
Maybe still might.
They're decent people.
But doesn't she also reflect on it later on that she actually wasn't a bad person, and she was well, in any case, she I think I remember her actually thinking that it wasn't fair that that these things happening to him, but because he was actually nice to her, a good person to her.
Sansa's very empathetic toward Tyrion. I just think that to me, under different circumstances, if she were 16 and this were a Lannister Stark marriage, that obviously would never happen under normal circumstances, but imagine that it did. Yeah. I could root for it a lot more than I do with her being hostage, forced to marry Tyrion. I think that they both really do basically do the best that they can in that situation. But for Sansa, it was always Sansa, to me, her view on Tyrion after is hey, it was a pretty nice guy that didn't go as badly as it could have. Glad it's over, And,
oh, really? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I don't think she wants to get back together with him or anything.
Oh no, I don't think she's there yet. But I mean, if she was offered to
just
be married.
Sandor.
That was the point I was getting to, actually, because when you look at it, basically what has happened between Sandor forced a kiss on her, right, and basically was a bit rapey, right? We agree with that. He was a bit over the top, at least with his request for her to join him on the road. I mean, Tyrion, he was respectful of her wishes, and well, she thinks back on both of them with in at least empathy or sympathy. There's no real indication that she has more feelings for Sandor than she has for Tyrion. So for all the people that ship Sandor, Clegane, they might just as well ship Tyrion, because in my point of view, if she doesn't have those kind of feelings for Tyrion, then she definitely doesn't have it for Sandor.
I don't agree. I think that, I mean, you can feel like I still don't know how I feel about Sansan, except that like deep in my soul I want it to happen. Other than that, but I think that Sansa attaches romantic feelings to the Hound, like rightly or wrongly, good or bad, whatever, that she doesn't attach to Tyrion, and that's fine. Like I don't think that. Like, to me, Sansa never looks poorly on Tyrion because she doesn't view him in a romantic light, you know? Like, she's always kind of viewed the Hound in a romantic light. That doesn't mean that him forcing a kiss on her and threatening to kill her is anything close to okay. But from Sansa's perspective, she's already, I think, more willing to view it in a more positive light, which is why I think people are inclined to ship it, because it's not like, you know, so much of all three of these chapters are really, like, it's very important to think about George's perspective on it. And I think George's perspective on Sansa's perspective is a lot more positive on an emotional level than George's perspective on Sansa's perspective on Tyrion, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I personally think that just those emotions you talk about, those inherently more romantic emotions towards Sandor, is not really there for me in the books, in the text. I don't really see it. So my point is basically that I don't see any real romantic connections, other than, I mean, he kind of wants some, right? So I don't know. I understand why people want a romantic connection, like a fallen knight and a highborn lady sort of thing. That makes sense. It's romantic, I know, but it's not there for me. And I think by that logic, I could just as well have seen her, especially now, later on, when she's much more pragmatic about everything, coming to the conclusion that it's might not be that bad to remarry Tyrion and, you know, live her life like that.
Well, Tyrion might be as nice as he might be. He's still a Lannister, and she's a Stark, and it's not going to work out.
Yeah.
Going back to Tyrion for a second, I feel like he's just dealing with a lot of rejection right now. Like, he's been dealing with this like throughout much of his storyline with, like, you know, his father rejecting him. But it, like, in this chapter, I think it's evident that like he's a bit confused about Sansa. Like she's already rejected him, like, on like a sexual level, I guess. But like she's also now like not even coming to his side for to stand up with him on Joffrey's death in the trial. But he doesn't know that she's actually going off to the Eyrie. But then eventually we're going to get to more rejection of, like, with Shay and the whole Tysha thing, and then Jaime. I feel like all these rejections just culminate in him, like, becoming this depressed person and going off and doing all this stupid stuff in Dance of Dragons.
Yeah, because I mean, Tyrion's whole thing is like is not feeling loved and convincing himself that certain people love him, and then when that shatters in quick succession, I think the outcome is perfectly understandable and very well written and astute on George's part, but I think it does go to a really nasty place despite that.
Yeah.
Anything else specifically on the chapter?
Just how Cersei is orchestrating this trial. It's very interesting that she's, usually people's perception is that Cersei isn't very smart, but how she's dealing with this whole thing is actually, makes sense. Like, Tyrion notices that she starts the witnesses with someone who's known to be very trustworthy, and as it goes on, the claims get more ludicrous as time goes on, but they become believable because, it starts off with something that's actually true, and then gradually,
it's really
there
clever.
are lies introduced, and so it's very interesting. Like, Cersei is doing this very smartly. She knows how to sway the audience.
I'm
I
just
also think
thinking of Legally Blonde Westeros now.
I also think it says something for Tyrion that he can see that and acknowledge it and respect it in his opponent. Like, a lot of people cannot do that. They can't bring themselves to acknowledge that the opponent is actually pretty smart and might have outwitted them. It's quite intellectually generous of him. Like when he's in his prison cell and is it Kevin comes to him and says, look, if you just confess, your dad will send you up to the wall and that'll be better for everybody. Do you think that was ever a legit offer? And would Tyrion have been wise to accept it?
I don't think Cersei would ever have let it go, no matter what his
Mhm.
father did. Like, if he confessed to Joffrey's murder, there was no way he was going to die.
So what you're saying by
Yeah.
implication is that Tywin could not have controlled her.
I don't think so.
I
I
think
don't even know
Cersei
if
would have.
Tywin really wanted to do that.
I kind of think that Tywin would have been okay with killing Tyrion only because, like, by the end of what he says in the Jaime chapter, he's like, he tells Jaime that he's going to be the king of Castle Rock, and it kind of feels like he's like, this is my plan. We're going to get Tyrion out of the way, so now Jaime, even though he's in the Kingsguard, can be the rightful heir. That was my kind of perspective on it, because I definitely don't think that they would have let him go up to the wall, especially since, like, I don't think the wall would even accept him as, like, what would he do? Like, he would take Sam's job.
Well,
I
he could be a
guess, but...
steward.
Research.
Yeah.
He could clean the latrines.
I think Tyrion. I mean, I think Tywin might have publicized, like they. I could see a certain like PR benefit to it, you know, of like he has confessed, and as our son, we will send him to the wall, and you know.
But he gets killed on the way. He never makes it.
Right, exactly. I don't expect that he would have.
Oh, he'd
either made it
accidentally
or
on purpose
lasted
just
it.
slip up and trip and fall on a dagger.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I've always thought is like he doesn't want to sentence a Lannister to death because we're Lannisters, you know, he still has that pride, but it's not really to do with Tyrion. It's to do with Lannisters, and so
has
he might
nothing to do
say
with
you're
Tyrion.
going to the wall, but he's definitely not going to actually let Tyrion live. I mean, I don't see that scenario playing out, and Tyrion's smart
Even
enough
if-
to know that.
Even if Tywin did, Cersei would definitely send someone after him. Like, she has the kettle black. I mean, I know they're on Super Littlefinger, but they're also kind of like listen to Cersei as well at the same time. So I mean, she could have sent anyone after him. Like, she would be out for blood if he confessed. So
Yeah.
I think he
It's all
was
very
he was doomed either way.
It's all a very interesting point to me that like this is kind of the you know part 2 of you know character we love in danger of their life or something that they didn't do, and oh look, but maybe they'll go to the wall, and I feel like we're all primed to kind of go like, oh yeah, no, Ned and Jon will rocket at the wall, okay, Jon and Tyrion and Sam will rocket at the wall, and then you know I wonder if George like is intentionally making this a repeated false promise, you know, both on the part of like in story and on a meta level, because the people we want,
Because we know the real fights at the wall.
yeah, well, we even have Arya in her chapter is like, I have a brilliant idea, and Clegane is like, fuck you.
I just had this like sort of total sort of alt history sort of reverie earlier where I was thinking, so Tyrion takes the deal and he makes it to the wall and then he becomes Lord Commander and all that stupid John nonsense doesn't happen. And then it's like Tyrion and Stannis versus the other. Yeah, anyway, never mind. Oh, also,
But historically, it has been like that has been the way to get rid of highborn people who committed treason or something. Like Bloodraven was sent to the wall.
Yeah,
because
right. So you could have a regicide there.
exactly. So it could have been. Well, he wasn't a regicide technically. He betrayed he murdered a traitor, but still, he betrayed Guestrise. That's why he was sent off to the wall. But still, like, it could have been a way out.
Yeah.
Hey, Glen, how are you? Do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Hi there, Glen here. DagosRivers from the forums. So, because I've missed about 30 minutes of the discussion, but one thing that always annoyed me when I read the chapter is it goes through 5-6 days, so it's like the pre-process where Tyrion's in his cell talking to Kevin and they're making preparations for the trial, and then the trial goes through 2-3 days, and then at that point when everything's going really pear-shaped for Tyrion and it looks like his doom is certain, then he decides to do trial by combat. So I feel like there should be something where you either decide one trial or trial by combat, not just switching to do trial by combat if you're losing.
You gotta make
the
choice beforehand.
Yeah.
Well, he does ask for it initially at the beginning of the chapter. He's like, "Can I do trial by combat? That worked for me before," and that's why he tries to go get Bronn.
Yeah. And then Bronn says
he doesn't feel it's an option,
Yeah.
But I mean, the legal system is very sketchy here. Yeah. I don't know. It's like the value of coins. So.
But I
Innocence
don't.
before proven guilty.
But
No
I don't
cross-
think.
Yeah, and you're like,
questioning.
okay, we're about to rule. This is going horrible. Trial by combat, whatever. I'm about to win. It's like, oh my
yeah,
god,
but
That doesn't look too good.
it's like one last chance, and like, you know, I guess the reason if you're a capable fighter, you would just always be like, yeah, trial by combat, let's do this. You know, I'll let my sword, you know, do the talking. But most of the time, most people probably aren't able to do that or willing to risk it.
But it's also like this is definitely a highborn thing, like not even a highborn thing, a high prestige house highborn thing, right? This is because he's a Lannister. He gets to like, I mean, if it was like the common folk, they're just like, oh, by the way, the gods want to take this instead of me, I think, because it's not looking good for me. That wouldn't have they wouldn't have been able to do that anyways. And I don't think if like some minor lord or lordling from some minor house said the same thing, that they would allow that. It's mainly because it's such a high profile
How many
case, right?
lowborns get a trial at all?
I mean,
That's a
don't
good
know.
point.
Tyrion's drinking wine in his cell. I don't think anybody else gets that.
Isn't his cell just his room also?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we agree now that he's actually not being treated that badly. Everything is actually fine for him, right? That's what we.
Well,
ended-
other than his life being torn apart, yeah.
And the
I mean-
potential of death or going to the wall. It's fine.
Well, I mean, that's why they're all just such like crazy hypocrites, right? Because it's like, oh, we couldn't possibly keep like a nobleman in a poor. You know, we see this over and over again. It's like even noted when Jaime's kept in like the bottom of River Run. It's like a weird thing, and it's only because he's Jaime. It's just, you know, it's like, well, we think you killed your nephew who was the king, but we won't like make you physically uncomfortable until we're absolutely sure, you know. So, and yeah, Kevin's even like, oh yeah, you can have sex with Sansa once we find her. That's fine. like that's totally cool. Even though they apparently have all decided that Sansa is like a crazy political mastermind now. So I don't know why he thought that would be a good idea.
Ned was the exception, right? He was thrown into the Black Cells right off, right? He
Yeah,
was, right? Like Cersei had
Yeah.
him thrown
He
into the
was,
Black
yeah.
Cells.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but then again, Starks don't need.
Jaime started off in a tower cell, but then Tyrion sent those mummers to break him out, and then he was shifted to the dungeons.
Yeah,
But
that's
Ned
true.
didn't get any of that. Like all his men were killed, and he was sent to the Black Cells.
But there's also a different thing between Jaime. He's not necessarily, when he's captured, he's not like a criminal. He's a prisoner of war and a highborn prisoner of war, right?
Yeah.
So the difference is that first of all, Ned is not a Lannister. He has no allies left, or everyone thinks he doesn't have any allies left. So he's thrown in the Black Cells. Tyrion is still a Lannister. Plus, he did like. I'm assuming that some people know that he did save the city, right? So that might also count for something. But yeah, and
No, Renly saved the city.
I don't think
Come on.
it has anything to do with Lannisters. It's just a custom that highborn captives are not sent to the dungeons; they're kept in tower cells. It's just a custom that they have in Westeros.
But why is Ned then? He's like the Warden of the North.
That might have been a power.
Yeah, but that was
Joffrey?
Cersei.
King.
Yeah, but it was Cersei who was calling the shot, right?
Yeah, but then
So-
again, it doesn't matter. So if Cersei was doing anything, having any influence on this, Tyrion would also be in the Black Cells, right? He would be dead.
Well, her father is in King's Landing right now, so she doesn't have any. She doesn't
Maybe.
have that kind of influence.
I don't.
At
I
that
don't
time,
agree with
she
that.
was the one in power.
I mean, I guess like there's maybe no point in looking for super consistency here among this crazy bunch of hypocrites, but like maybe you can like view it as a metric of danger that like Ned had been actively pursuing dethroning Joffrey, quote unquote, right? And like maybe they would think that he would still have allies, or I don't know.
Maybe.
Whereas Tyrion is like nobody thinks Tyrion's dangerous.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, anything more on the juicy mess, hot mess that this is? I guess my closing remark is I love how Varys can just show up in court and say, yeah, I have spies. You can't kind of cross-question them because they're spies. And I have lists of things I wrote down from them. And everyone's like, yeah, this is evidence that we could admit into a court of law. Brilliant.
Not a he said, she said. It's totally legit. I thought it was really funny that like that was like a thing that was okay.
It's just so blatant. Like I knew that the Lannisters would pay people to lie and set them up right, but just the fact that Varys can just so blatantly do that just shows you how corrupt and this is just like a Stalinist era show trial, isn't it? It's hilarious. There we
I did
go.
like the reference to what's her name, Taina Merriweather, and Tyrion's like, I don't even know you. Like, were you even there?
Excellent.
And of course, we know exactly why she's there, but
Indeed. Okay,
Maybe
I thought
this
that
is a
the
discussion for the next Tyrion chapter, but do we think Bronn could have won against the Mountain?
yeah, because the Mountain's just a big lug, isn't he? And he's
That's
injured.
just it. He's not. He's not. He's actually. Bronn says that for his size, he's actually pretty fast.
But isn't
And he
he, as
has like
Tyrion
a
says, carrying
very
injuries, right? So he's like Mountain minus 10 points right now.
well, he does, but as we see later, like he still manages to do pretty well, even though he's injured. He gets like a poison spear and everything, but he still manages to kill Oberyn.
I don't think you're taking into account that that Oberyn stood above him, lording his victory. So there's a big difference. I don't think Bronn would go around, yeah, I'm the best, you suck. Oh yeah, what did you say? Smash. I don't
Well,
think that would have
yeah,
happened.
maybe, but but if I were Bronn, I would not take that risk, so I can't blame him.
Yeah, the
Okay.
problem with fighting the Mountain is that, like, you can go in with as much strategy and whatever as you want, but, like, one wrong swipe and you're totally dead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Well, this has been
Which
a
is
good...
why I would advise against it, just in general, if you guys were wondering.
PSA.
Yeah.
Don't
Yeah.
fight.
No trial by
Oh.
combat when he's involved.
Okay. Does someone want to do a proper VOK PSA for the top of the show? Patrick?
No, not really.
Okay, cool.
Warning, fighting the Mountain may result in total death.
Maiming and other unpleasant things.
Gouge
Will he be
dies,
totally
loss of
dead or mostly
limbs.
dead?
You can get better.
Yeah, you could choose your shade of death.
Because there's a difference, Okay. I feel this air of levity is probably not appropriate to transition into Jamie 7, but it's Vox, so here we go. This is actually in the midst of the Tyrion 9 chapter, which starts on January the 7th and goes to the 13th. This happens on January the 8th, so we're actually going back a few days for Jamie's return to King's Landing. This is 4 chapters prior to Tyrion 9 in the text, or 70 pages in my edition of the book. And I believe Patrick has a summary of the chapter. Over to you, Patrick.
Yeah, and a quick disclaimer. I sort of, when I wrote this, I feel like I might have sometimes channeled that Valley Girl when I wrote it. So there might be stuff like that's reminiscent of a teenage girl when I write this.
That is definitely not the disclaimer I thought you were going to give.
No, there is
Not at
another.
all.
The whole discussion that we will get into, I have some extra stuff next to that, which will not be in a Valley Girl tone, so don't worry about that. Jaime learns of Joffrey's death. There are different accounts of the events. Jaime thinks of Cersei. Mage comments on King's Landing's specific bouquet. He wonders about his lack of emotions regarding his son's death. On his way to King's Landing with Qyburn, Mage, Brienne, and Longshanks, he longs after the company of Cleo's Frey. They have heard about the Red Wedding from Lord Beesbury, and Brienne is depressed. Jaffrey offers to give her passage to Tarth now that her tasks are complete. They enter the city and travel towards the keep. They meet Meryn and further in Loras and Balon on the way. When Loras sees Brienne, he's kind of miffed with her because she totally thinks she shanked him. She shanked Renly rather, or whatever. Jaime pulls rank or something, but has to arrest her to meet Loras halfway. In the castle sept, he meets a grieving Cersei. They catch up on what's happened, and she asks Jaime to kill Tyrion, but he's reluctant. There's a scene that I will go further into, so we'll jump right up through that, and then go to afterwards, where later he arrives at Tyrion's office and later he arrives at Tywin's office, and Tywin promises retribution for the Hand. He learns that Vargo Hoat has had a bad time after Brienne's goodbye. This amuses him. Tywin wants Jaime to go to Castle Rock, but Jaime refuses strongly. Tywin is like, fine, be like that. Oh, and by the way, you're not my son anymore. So that's the main summary. We jumped over a very specific part of the scenes, and I did that intentionally. So yeah, so there is this talk about Jaime or at least from when people saw the Game of Thrones series from HBO, it became apparent that a lot of people have thought, or began to think at least, that this scene between Jaime and Cersei in the crypt, where they end up having sex, could be seen as Jaime forcing himself on her, and it's being close or actual rape. To that, I am not giving my specific opinion on until I state I've found every single line and everything that either points to or away from the notion that he raped her. So how do you guys want to do this? Do you want me just to list them up?
I think how we should do this discussion is first talk, really do a literary breakdown and get into how we interpreted that text, what we think happens for or against. And then we can talk about maybe how the show tackled it and why that was controversial. And finally talk about why scenes like this in general are controversial in the fandom, what that says about society and just the state of dialogue. Does that make sense? So start micro and get bigger. And just to get into it, listeners, rather than just try and summarize what happens, because it's actually a really surprisingly short scene, I'm just going to read it out so then we can get into the crunching the text. So, starting off, there was no tenderness in the kiss he returned to her, only hunger. Her mouth opened for his tongue. No, she said weakly when his lips moved down her neck. Not here, the septons. The others can take the septons. He kissed her again, kissed her silent. Then he knocked the candles aside and lifted her up onto the mother's altar, pushing up her skirts and the silken shift beneath. She pounded on his chest with feeble fists, murmuring about the risk, the danger, about their father, about the septons, about the wrath of the gods. He never heard her. He undid his breeches and climbed up and pushed her bare white legs apart. One hand slid up her thigh and underneath her small clothes. When he tore them away, he saw that her moon's blood was on her, but it made no difference. Hurry, she was whispering now. Quickly, quickly, now, do it now, do me now. Jaime, Jaime, Jaime. Her hands helped guide him. Yes, Cersei said as he thrust. My brother, sweet brother, yes, like that. Yes, I have you. You're home now, you're home now, you're home. She kissed his ear and stroked his short bristly hair. Jaime lost himself in her flesh. He could feel Cersei's heart beating in time with his own, and the wetness of blood and seed where they were joined. But no sooner were they done than the queen said, "Let me up, if we are discovered like this." Reluctantly he rolled away and helped her off the altar. That's basically the end of the... Actually, no, there's a few more lines where she then says, "This was folly," and pulled her gown straight. So that's the kind of the key text, although, Patrick, have you got lines before that you think are relevant to the context of this?
Yeah, there are two. There's the first one where he says, she just stood there. She has never come to me. I have to come to her, ask her. That's the one thing. It kind of lends into the relationship that they have, basically, that he needs to show that he wants her, basically. I don't know.
Although there's a
At
very
least,
interesting discussion to be had about whether one should take context into account.
maybe, yeah, maybe not. But that it still lends into the whole his mindset of the
Yeah,
thing.
okay.
So, and then he said he could feel her tremble as he slid her arms around her. So she is, well, we assume she's not afraid of him. So there is some other feelings behind there. That's the only two.
But
I
is that
put
a
those.
false assumption, though? Like, I mean, should we assume she's not afraid of him? I mean, this is a very specific place in which to have this
She
encounter.
never seems to be like anywhere else. I think that's what Patrick is saying.
Yeah, so this is my point about context. I was thinking about this a lot in reference to, I was talking with some friends about the Harvey Weinstein case and about how he could be prosecuted on both sides of the ocean and the differences in law. And one of them is related to the statute of limitations, but another one is related to, I believe, which way round is it? In the UK, you can talk about prior offences and build up a pattern and talk about context. But in America, I believe you can't, or it's a bit
I think
more of a
I
grey
think it
line.
might be at the
sometimes you
discretion
can,
of the
but
judge.
yeah,
Okay.
usually they try very hard to not allow that to happen.
Because obviously one of the arguments for people who say that this isn't a rape is that, well, they have this pattern where she kind of plays a bit coy because it's a relationship founded on danger and transgression. And so she doesn't want to be seen to be wanting it, but so he has to come after her. And because we've seen patterns of that in the past, that excuses him. But there is a line in here where he's like, she wouldn't have heard anyway, right? Even if she had properly said no. But anyway, sorry, carry on, Patrick, with your, I'm skipping ahead.
Yeah, no, that's and then she says to him, "I'm not whole without you." kind of referring, and I know this again, me the reader with a specific point of view, but she referenced the whole being whole when she talks about having sex with him prior. Like she felt like they were complete, right, when they were together. So that's just a thing that I also take in as a, at least an indicator to some sort of intent or lack of.
Well, it's an indicator to, I'm being a bit devil's advocate, it's an indicator towards emotional wholeness or loving him. It's not necessarily an indicator to wanting sex right now, right?
No. I'm not saying again.
It's context, yeah.
It's again about thinking what might be a point of view from the one who is advocating that this is not rape.
Yeah.
And this would be a thing they could grab hold onto, because it seems like she's still romantically interested in him, even though it might not be interested in sex right now. That's the whole discussion, right?
Yeah.
The thing is, I partly feel like this is so confusing because Jaime and Cersei are fundamentally confusing. The issues of consent between them are always really strange, and like they are clearly in love. They don't seem to like each other very much though. And like they're usually not around each other when they aren't arguing about something, and like obviously in this context it's a little bit of like Jaime having been like undergone his transformation, like he's all different, yay. But I think that like we can't know necessarily, like they don't seem to have a lot of respect for each other's boundaries anyway, like the whole idea of Jaime kind of wanting to act as a father to Joffrey, and Cersei's like, absolutely not, no, and like we totally get that, but it's also something that Jaime wants to do that she's not like allowing, and that she takes full control over. And I don't know, it's a really messy, ugly, gross relationship. Like there's nothing pure about this. So to me, like in understanding the scene, like I think it's very important to read it of itself, but I think there's also a certain level of like, to me, I don't think there is a firm yes or no answer because of how clouded this relationship is. Like if this had been almost any other couple, I think we would all have a vastly different perspective, but it's not. It's Jaime and Cersei, and they come with plenty of baggage.
So reading it, but trying to read it qua text, the first sentences or the first line of dialogue is "No, not here." The sentence. So he's attempting to kiss her, and she says, "No, not here. People about." And he kisses her silent and then starts.
But don't you feel like that is kind of every interaction they have is like a stolen interaction? I mean, like they're never open about their relationship, but like they seem to get together quite often from what what the text tells us, from what their internal monologue tells us.
Yeah, I do. I guess what kind of worries me a little bit is there's the line. Where's the line? Like she's kind of like muttering the reasons why she doesn't want to do it, which again could be part of their way of initiating sex, which is talking about the danger and actually maybe getting off on it, right? But then he said, there's a line where George R. R. Martin says he never heard her. So the point is not whether or not she gives consent. It's almost like he's not even open to the hearing of it.
Yeah.
Because he's so caught up in his own physical needs and desires. He's not actually even hearing her.
Yeah.
And then so happens, like my interpretation for what it's worth is, she starts off saying no. He at that point is proceeding without consent because he genuinely isn't hearing. But he's probably making assumptions based on context. She then gets into it, like when she's like, hurry, do it now. Yes, you're home, my sweet brother. And she's kissing his hair and stroking his bristly hair. But it's almost like by that point, even though she is consenting, it's almost irrelevant because he's already shut down hearing it. It's so messy. It's almost like every line I read sort of changed my opinion of what was happening.
I think the most relevant line is the line about the candles, that he says the candles fell over the edge and nothing happened, nothing caught fire, but if it did, then they wouldn't have noticed, or Jaime wouldn't have cared enough to notice. So it could have been a much more horrific scene with the set catching fire.
Yeah, which goes to my point about him not hearing. Like he's not available to hear a response from Cersei or notice a candle falling or something catching fire.
Yeah, I think I agree to a certain extent. I had a discussion with my wife when I was listening through the episode of the Word to Trees chapter with this, and well, he doesn't make it better, I have to say. Well, whenever sex is involved, Roy de Trees is not your man.
R.I.P. By the way,
Oh,
by
Pitara.
by the way,
guys,
yeah.
he just died.
Yeah, that is sad though.
R.I.P.
Well,
Roy
I
de
mean,
Trees.
we
Thank
love-
you for all the
we love
memories,
Roy
but
de
not the sex
Trees.
scenes.
Thanks
no,
for all
we're doing that in this scene.
yeah, thanks for all the scars. But yeah, no, we talked about it, and I got the thought that to put up a hypothetical, what if she hadn't gone into it? Would he have stopped? That is the
No,
question
that's
for
the
me.
point. Because I think well, I don't know, what's your opinion? My opinion is he wouldn't because he was just so into it.
I mean, it depends. I mean, she didn't really, protest as strongly as she could, but that's not a real argument either. So it's difficult. That is a very difficult discussion. The thing I, focused on was that on the one side he says, well, he never heard her, but the other side he's like, the reference to that he wouldn't have noticed if the set burned down. Does that take something away from that line with he never heard her? Is it more like he got into the moment, and if she had protested more strongly, would he have noticed that specifically? Because he was right, he was more focused on those two rather than all the other things.
But she does protest. I mean, she says no. I mean, I think I hadn't noticed it before, but the phrase "kissed her silent" I think is very provocative, right? Because how can she protest more strongly when he's, if someone's really like mashing their face up against you can't protest strongly, right?
But
And then
then-
she's pounding
but
on his
then-
chest with feeble fists, so she's he's he's a big guy. She's trying to. So I think the kind of the gradation of protestation isn't a thing to me. To me, it's more that for me, he's in the moment. Does the fact that she's then in the moment justify the fact that he started without her consent?
I know it's not. Again, as I said, I know that the whole putting a value on how strongly someone protests in this kind of situation is a very slippery slope, first of all. But in this case, I'm just saying that whenever it is said something where she protests, it then is underlined that with some other word, like she pounded on his chest with feeble fist, like she's not putting her strength into it. She's just protesting. And if that's that is into a part of the relationship that she says no, because there's also the whole where she has, I mean, we can talk about the tower scene in Bran in the first book where she also protests. There is. It seems
well,
like
I think let's do this scene and then let's talk about context around it, because that'll be just a way of keeping it in.
Okay.
Nadia, do you want to
About the
go
line
next
that-
and then
yeah.
Casey?
Yeah, just the line that we were talking about. He kissed her again, kissed her silent, kissed her until she moaned. Like, he didn't just kiss her silent, they were kissing for a while.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at that point, she's not protesting. But then when they start moving on to the next step, that's when she starts, talking about, at no point does she say, I don't want to do this. Her protests are more like, this is not the appropriate place for this, right?
But is that different?
No point do either of them acknowledge that their son has just died and his dead body is right there.
I know, that's appalling. I just wanted
That is the sweetest part of this.
But before bringing in Casey, I just want to talk about the word feeble, which is, it could mean that you're doing it feebly, like you're not protesting as much as you might, you're doing it kind of half-heartedly. But it can also just mean weak, as in she's a woman, so her wrists, her fists are going to be feeble compared to him. And there is definitely an ambiguity in the use and deployment of that word that maybe George wasn't even aware of, because he didn't realize writing in 2010 in a quite different time about focus on sexual relations and consent that this was going to be really picked up on as much. Casey, your thoughts on the scene? Sorry, Nadia.
I don't imagine Cersei being the kind of person who would do anything feebly. Like she works herself up into a rage over the little things. If she wanted to like actually protest, I think she would put her entire force into this. But we don't really know what George was intending when he wrote this. So I mean, we can't judge it. The problem is we're not in Cersei's head right now, right? We can't know what she's thinking at this point.
And there's also the whole thing that when you just said we're not in Cersei's head, we're actually in Jaime's head. So what we're actually seeing this from his perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I, like, despite all that, I think this is clearly Jaime just forcing himself upon her. I don't, like, see any, like, she does say yes afterwards, or not afterwards, I guess during, but I feel like the no in the beginning just cancels all of that out. And this is, like, I'm saying this, like, without taking into context, like, the relationship and what George has to say. On this, I actually, like, I know we'll go into it more later, but I feel like George kind of failed here. It was a different time, but the way that I read it is clearly a no. And, no means no. So it's rape. It's not even, like, I don't want even to say that this, like, concludes in sex.
To me, I just kind of feel like this is like, wow, absolutely don't do this. Like, this is bad behavior. Wrong, Jaime, bad. But I go a little further, I think, than you, Casey, which is that I don't know. I mean, Casey, was anyone here? Did you like see the show before you read the scene? Like, is anybody in that position?
So I watched the show first before reading the books, and this actually happened. Like, I was watching this episode with my friend. It was right around when this was the first season I was watching in real time, and I was watching it with friends, and my friend was completely appalled by it, and she was also a book reader, and so eventually, like, I read the books, but I had the books at the time, so I went and read this chapter before even reading the books, because I was reading GOT, but I wasn't there yet, and so I read this, and I was like, this is rape too. I don't understand what's going on here. And to see what George wrote, it was just very confusing. But I can see, like, the scene is so short that, like, I can totally understand why people would just, like, skip this over. Like, I almost wonder, like, in the fandom before the show, like, how big of a deal was this scene?
It totally
in the
wasn't a
fandom
big
before
deal.
the show. No, it wasn't a big deal. It was the period sex
different.
scene that was
Yeah.
yeah.
I think in the
That's why
fandom
when
before the
this
show, it
episode-
was just like we assumed these guys have a fucked up dynamic. It was all about context. We can get to the Winterfell sex scene. That this is how they do things, and also I think there was textual analysis, but a lot of it focused on, okay, this is Jaime's point of view, but if it's Cersei's point of view, we do get Cersei chapters in this book. Why doesn't she ever say, God, that was just fucked up. The guy who I thought was in love with me has just raped me, and that has crossed. I'm really angry and hurt and confused, and I mean,
I would argue that, like,
but that could be George's
might want
bad
to suppress
writing.
the memory. Yeah, it could be bad writing, but it could also be, like, I don't think, like, people can dwell on it, but people can also, like, suppress and just try not to think about it.
So it's hard to know. I think one of the really hard things is to know when George is trying to do that or when it's bad writing.
I would say that Cersei shows no inclination to me of doing that, like, because we also see how she is with Robert, who she views as, like, almost their entire relationship as non-consensual on her part, and she's furious about that and emphatic that
she lives
raped.
so on the surface, right? So it kind of feels like it's Jaime's the one who goes away inside, whereas she's the one who'd be. But then, like, being raped by Jaime, your brother, is very different from being raped by your husband, who you never loved. And, well, it's a very different dynamic, in fairness, and we shouldn't assume that your reaction to being raped by one person would be transferred to being raped by another. But yeah, like, Casey, to answer your question, like, I read this well before the show. It totally wasn't a big deal. There wasn't that much online discussion, and the show's interpretation of it as a straightforward rape, that was the shocking bit that then caused George to speak out about it. But I have to say, as with one of the wonderful things about the show is, even when I've really disagreed with it, it has provoked me to go back and read the text more closely. And I think actually the text is far more ambiguous than I had thought on my first read. So I think that's a good thing, right? Because it really made me question, well, how do I feel about consent? And lots of, like, big philosophical questions, like, should context matter? just because they've had this very weird dynamic before, does that excuse it? This, it makes you really think of all these really important real life issues. So I'm thankful to it for that.
I also wanted to bring up, like, this is a bit more like a real world context, but California just like passed a law that is like a yes means yes law, which is basically like the only way that consent is if they say blatantly yes, and there's not any nuance anymore. That's just like it can't be like a no, maybe, like.
So you have to ask the question.
I mean, I don't know the. I can pull up the article for you guys, but it's on the Washington Post.
Yeah, I remember hearing like about that legislation like a year ago or something.
I think it just came out. Like they just made it a law.
On it.
So Casey, can I flip the question then? When you realised that this wasn't controversial in the fan until the show, or when you saw all the kind of outrage after the show, like why did they make it a rape scene? Did you find that kind of disappointing? Were you disappointed in the fandom, or do you think it's kind of weird that we hadn't picked up on it in a way?
I mean, I'm trying to think back to the time that this all happened, because I'd only read like maybe a third of Game of Thrones, like the first book, and I was just like I just cruised through the first 3 seasons, and I'm trying to think, like, I feel like at the time, like I guess I was a junior in college, like a lot of this more like political aspect of like these TV shows and how they present things and how the public views them. Like I saw an interesting post on one of the things that you posted on the thread that was like they could have just inserted yes and the whole scene would have changed. It just seems like the show did a bad job. I also think that George may have done a bad job here, but I wonder if like just more awareness of bad things that happen to women maybe taking a part in like making us more aware of these scenes and how they're problematic and how they're viewed by the public and how like people differ on those opinions. It's slightly disappointing, but it's also like I feel like there's been like a progression of thought in here, and I don't know if it's because I was in college, I was just getting older and like more aware of things, and today, like even talking about this in the way we are now is a bit, people would be like, why are you doing this?
Yeah, which I mean, I think it's like both. It's a question of both sides of it finding it equally shocking on the other side, right? I mean, but that's why we have things like Vogue to talk all this stuff out in a nice and friendly way.
So I have a question, Casey. Also, I mean, you can choose not answer because it's not really. But okay, the question is, if you had read all the books, would you think in that scenario, would you think that, and you read the chapter before you saw the show, would you then think that you've seen it exactly the same way, or would you might also have been, putting less weight on that scene? I mean, just going over it maybe.
I don't know if I can answer because, like, I mean, I read these books one way, and even like going back and reading like the Game of Thrones chapter where Bran discovers Cersei and Jaime, and even I posted the Asha chapter from Dance of Dragons where she and I think his name's pronounced Carl go through a different similar situation, and it, like, reading it now I'm like quite like shocked, but I'm also like thinking back to like how I would have read it like before any of this happened. I was definitely a different person back in college, like even before college, so like I feel like I could have glazed over it, but I don't really know. But
yeah, that's a hard question to answer. Like, like, what would your perspective have been? Like,
And that's why I said it was totally fine not to answer it, because it's not completely. You can't say for sure anything, but sometimes the whole question itself can at least make the discussion about whether the thing that is the worst might affect everything else in that material. And we definitely agree that the show did it in the most rapey way, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, right, though, because they didn't. I don't know, like Michal was saying on the chat just now, and I totally agree that you could almost sort of read this same chapter with different intonation and make it feel like totally different things, and you can portray it in different media as different things with the same words. The show obviously went one way. I think it's fascinating that because of the controversy of the show, it's probably worth pointing out that neither the showrunners nor the actress who played Cersei nor George think it's a rape scene in the book. And the showrunners and the actress who plays Cersei don't think it's a rape scene in the show, which I just find flabbergasting.
Right.
But
Right. That's
Jamie,
the weird thing.
yeah. So let me,
Yeah.
shall I read the
Yeah. They were
quotes? Let me read the quotes because
Yeah,
I think it's important. So after the episode aired, Alex Graves, who's the director, told Alan Sepinwall, quote, "The sex becomes consensual by the end because anything for Cersei and Jamie ultimately results in a turn on, especially a power struggle," which I find doesn't matter because if the consent was held at the beginning, it doesn't matter if, anyway. So I just think that just shows confusion on his part. Nikolai Coster-Waldau, who plays Jamie, says something far more nuanced in the Daily Beast. Quote, "Yes and no as to whether it's rape. Yes and no. There are moments where she gives in and moments where she pushes him away." So I guess the question for me is, does the order matter? And because she says no first, that to me would kind of trump the yes, but that's just me. And then Lena Headey, who plays Cersei, thinks her character was a willing participant. Quote, "There's lust and desperation and, a need to feel something other than this searing empty loss. And so that's where I came from when we were filming. There was this need and it wasn't right and yet it felt great." She said that on a Google Hangout. So basically she thinks that she was saying no more to having it in the crypt, but she still wanted the sex, if that makes sense. How do you guys feel about the
I
show
think that's
interpretation?
what
So
I read.
weird.
Like,
Nadia, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm just saying that's kind of like how I read it first time I read this.
But she's talking about
I-
the scene in the show, not the book, right?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, the show made it like very obviously rape.
But she
I
even
remember
thinks in the
rewatched
show
the
it's
scene.
not right.
struggling. Like I don't remember that scene exactly. I haven't seen it in a while, but I remember like she was struggling.
Yeah,
the
she'll be
whole
talking about the show because she doesn't read the books.
Yeah, that's what I find amazing is that she doesn't even think the show makes it look rapey, whereas I watched the show and I was like, my God, that's really rape. And I immediately went back to read the book because I thought, have I misread this all these? I think everyone did, right? We went back and thought, have we been like missing something here?
We were like, wait, what the hell happened? Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas I think Costa-Waldau is more honest but even that, I don't know. To me, the show's less ambiguous.
That like really takes me aback, and it kind of shows like how culturally like we're I feel like a lot of people are just not in tune on like what rape is, and it kind of disturbs me and it kind of disgusts me, like particularly with the Game of Thrones scene. Like I understand to an extent why people see this book, like the scene in the book, to be different, but like I'm just like I'm a bit flabbergasted really on why like a lot of these, especially the actors, why they like thought this was totally fine.
Honestly, to me, I think that a lot of them actually hadn't seen it when they were asked to comment about it. I think I remember a lot of them saying like, "Whoa, whoa." Like Lena Headey was like, "I haven't seen it, so I don't know," but it didn't feel like rape when we were shooting it. And to me, I think like the incredible obtuseness of the director and Benioff and Weiss's comments as well, like to me, very much seemed like none of them actually thought, or it must have felt very different on set. I
just wish they've got a focus group to watch it. I mean, any scene maybe it just shows how blasé they were about sexual violence, because any scene like this, that even if in the book we're saying it's ambiguous, when you shoot it before it goes out, surely you get a little multi-gender ethnic focus group to look at it and say, what does this present as?
I mean, I remember I got, that was the first year I got screeners, I think, and it was early enough in the show that I had screeners of it, like in the season, and I was like stuck to my couch, and like I immediately messaged somebody who I knew also had screeners, and I was like, what just happened? And he was like, yeah, we just kind of have to separate the books and the show. And I mean, to me, it was very much like, I don't know. I think it's incredibly fascinating. Like, I actually think you could write like a very long piece about comparing the way people viewed the scene in the books for a really long time and the way they responded to the show. Because I think a lot of people, myself included, were like, that didn't happen in the books. And then you went back and read it, and it was a lot closer to that than we had all realized, as has been stated. But I mean, I think it's an incredibly fascinating issue, and part of it might just be that George didn't write the scene that well.
I mean, that's what I'm coming to the conclusion of, actually, because just like like he also commented after the show, and I'm just going to read it again. Sorry, guys, I know I'm talking a lot. I just think it's better to quote than try and represent. He says, in the novels, Jaime is not present at Joffrey's death, and indeed Cersei has been fearful that he is dead himself, that she has lost both the son and the father. And then suddenly Jaime is there before her, maimed and changed, but Jaime nonetheless. Though the time and place is wildly inappropriate and Cersei is fearful of discovery, she is as hungry for him as he is for her. And then, like, he talks about the dynamic being different on the show. But then he says, this is really interesting, if the show had retained some of Cersei's dialogue from the books, it might have left a somewhat different impression. The scene was always intended to be disturbing, but I do regret if it has disturbed people for the wrong reasons. In other words, I think he, like the director of the show, thinks that because halfway through she goes from saying no to yes, you're home now, do me now, that then it's okay. Like, he doesn't think it's rape. The question is does that matter? Like, if he writes a scene that is a rape, does it matter that the author think it isn't? Like, this is kind of a sort of philosophical question about literature.
I don't think it does. Yeah. So I just want to say, like, how I read this section of the book, like, regardless of what George thinks. Like, he says no, or she says no from the beginning, but while it eventually turns into a yes quickly, the initiation of the interaction, like, I think trumps all of the rest. Jaime, it feels like he overpowers her. This whole chapter, he just seems very angry. And whether it is for lust, love, or because of the overwhelming emotion that he feels in this chapter, I feel he's overstepped his boundary, and, like, Cersei's like pounding on his chest, asking him to stop. And I know it turns into a, like, you know, let's go, let's do this. But I feel like that's almost like a way of, like, let's just hurry this up. I want to get this over with. Let's stop, like, just just finish. And that's what disturbs me. Like, I feel like, you know, this no turning into a yes isn't actually there. I feel like it's a no turning into, like, let's quicken this up, let's hurry this up. I just want this experience to be over. Whether that's what Cersei thinks is another question, and I know that George doesn't write it that way, but when I read that, that's what I read.
You see, I at first thought, yeah, maybe when she's then saying yes, it's just, okay, I can't physically stop this guy, so let's just get this, I don't want this, let me just get this over with as soon as possible. But then there's the line which is afterwards, it's like she's kissed his ear and stroked his short bristly hair. And that felt like quite a sort of a tender thing to me. And I was like, well, if it was just about getting it done, wouldn't you have literally got it done, push him off you, and then say, I don't know.
I don't think that matters. Yeah. I don't think that matters, though, because I think that it's like, you know, she wants to have sex with him, but she doesn't want to have it there. Regardless of her wanting to have sex with him in another place, she doesn't want it there. But she still, in the end, I guess, has affection for him, and she does do that. But I feel like the whole situation still just it doesn't seem in any way okay.
So I totally respect that point of view. So from your perspective, it's not okay for Jaime to transfer the fact that in Winterfell, when she said no, she wanted it. Like, you can't transfer that from one occasion to the other, basically. Consent cannot be assumed or transferred, I guess.
I mean, to be fair, in that situation, they had hidden themselves in a tower at Winterfell, and here they were basically in public.
Yeah. Well, he's got guards on the door. I suppose she thinks they can come in at any time. Yeah. Oh, it's such a mess. So
I feel like this is an insight into their relationship, because we only see a handful of scenes with them together, and they usually have sex. So there's either in A Feast for Crows or in this, in The Storm of Swords, it mentions at one point they have sex right in front of Robert, and I feel like it could have been something similar where they're saying no, Robert will wake up, but then Jaime's still forcing himself upon her. And other places where there's risk everywhere that you go, that it's a similar dynamic, that there's always, like, hesitation from Cersei's side, but not to say that it's rape, because they still have passion for each other, but it's just like the timing and where it's happening.
Yeah.
I mean, something I really think about a lot is that this scene is very reflective of the fact that, like, consent between Jaime and Cersei in general is not really a thing. You know, like, they are in such incredible, like, overwhelmingly passionate love with each other, and neither of them gives a crap about what the other wants. Like, the entire reason that Jaime is on the Kingsguard is, and I'm not at all comparing that to rape at all, but in terms of, like, you know, she seduces him into agreeing to join the Kingsguard. You know, that's a fundamental, that's a pivotal moment in their relationship and in Jaime's life. You know, I think that, and I mean, again, it's hard to say without, like, actually quoting it. So maybe I shouldn't say this, but, like, I think there's a line, like, you know, by the end of the night, he would have given her anything she wanted. And I just think that, like, the way, I don't know. I mean, I think the way they use sex is just very different. Like, I don't think that
it's a dangerous game that both of them play. And I wonder if this therefore creates a sort of, it leads us down the garden path as readers. And I wonder if this is how I came to it the first time I read it, which is why I thought it was much less ambiguous and much more not rape than I do now. Now I think it's probably like more rape than not, but still very, very much on the sort of borderline. But I think because you come to this scene seeing Cersei as being far more manipulative, far more exploitative of his sexual weakness, like I always saw them up to this point as he was much more wide-eyed, naive, in love with her than she was with him. And I've always seen her as the real, the dominant power in the relationship. So therefore, when I came to this scene, because you come with baggage, right, and you come with your preconceptions, it sort of felt to me like it was more of a sort of a rather perverse and violent sexual foreplay before a consensual act. Because it just didn't like occur to me that she would be in the vulnerable position. But of course, you can have someone who's psychologically manipulative and always in the power seat and still gets physically dominated and has something awful done to her, right? And this violation done to her. And I think it's a lot, and I was thinking about this in the context of all sorts of characters in Game of Thrones where, because you've loved them for so long, like Tyrion, that when he finally, I think, rapes someone, it takes you a while to realize that that's happened because you come to it thinking that he's the good guy. You know, a lot of the things that happen in this beautiful series, because it is by and large well written, you get so invested in the characters, it really colors your view of things, and you've got to almost like take a break, come back and really read the text to figure out what's going on. And to me, I guess I've come out on the side a bit like Casey, that the initial no is a no, and the fact that she then gets into it afterwards doesn't matter, because to me the key thing is if she had truly said no the second time, he wouldn't have heard her because he was so into it, maybe. But you don't know, it's a hypothetical. It's just crazy balls.
My only thing I would say about that is that, and I'm not at all disagreeing, but I think going forward, I have a hard time being like, event in the series, Jaime rapes Cersei, because that's not the way the characters view it, and clearly it's not the way George views it. So I had this problem in the show. I was really really angry, and people were like, well, when are we going to see the fallout of Jaime clearly raping Cersei? And they were like, we're not, because they didn't. You know, like if the show or if the media considers something a certain way, we can call bullshit on that, but we also, I think, have to, in fairness, expect the show or the media to move in that same direction, you know?
Yeah.
Let's well, now we're talking about that, we can go to the whole thing about, you know, evaluating the show merely on its reaction. I mean, whenever a scene like that, if they feel like it's not rape, everyone says that this is not supposed to be rape. Is it then, as you said with George, is it then poorly made? Is it cinematically poorly made? Is it that's a mistake on their part?
Yeah, I think that's a technical failure. It's a failure of writing, a failure of directing. If you think you're showing one thing and like 90% feel the other way. And I think the same's true of George. Like just because George says it isn't rape, like if he's written it in a way that it is, then it is, right? I mean, it's like you don't get to sort of somehow circumvent, because the text is the text, it's the canon, right? I go back and forth on it though, I have to say.
People have a different view because they were written 60, 70 years ago, but they're considered racist now.
Well, I mean, it's like Bina was saying, like, it's kind of hard because if George says it's not, like, how do we read it going forward? Like, and Michal, I know you're also saying also, I just, like, I view it as bad writing, but when I read Jaime going forward, like, even though I think this is rape on his part, like, I still see him as a nuanced gray area character because there's a lot of different things to his character. Like, ultimately in the books, like, I don't really like Jaime that much, but I still see that he's on a redemptive arc. So it is like a weird, like, mind paradox in a bit. But you know, it's definitely difficult as a reader to have this scene and then, like, you know, go forward and to, you know, think highly of the character.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the problem is you do get coloured by the fact that Jaime's on this redemptive arc, then this sort of falling back into rape is kind of like, I think you almost like it's like confirmation bias, because you know that he's on this redemption arc. You almost like sort of deselect evidence that prove he's not, or kind of minimize it in a way. That's kind of what I was talking about by bringing baggage to the scene.
I think that, I mean, we have different points of view of stuff, and there's definitely the idea that we bring our own baggage, and that definitely will color our emotions on this. And there are also, you know, different nationalities also have different, you know, points of view on or levels of point of view on different matters. But so what I wanted to do was, as we did when in the Wolfcast, when we had this discussion, we had a very lively discussion about this when this episode came out. Was just to think about it objectively. And yeah, as I said, as we came into it's about when when so many misconstrues a scene, then it's bad filming, it's bad cinema. And to that extent, we can bring that point over to the objective effect of George's writing. Then, if he has no intention of this being rapey, then he shouldn't have written it like that. There's just, that is an objective effect of it. If he had complete control of his and had a complete foresight about what people would have understood this scene to be, then he would have maybe have written it differently. But
but then he comes to it with baggage.
He brings his own baggage. So it's just, the point is that he is, well, maybe he's just human like everyone else, and he makes a mistake, but
he's also himself. Like he said, nationality makes a difference. What I was thinking about with George is this was written in 2010. He was 52 at the time. He's the same age as my dad. My dad doesn't view sexual and gender relations as lovely as he is in the same way as I do. And I don't view them in the same way as Casey does, because with, as you're younger and grow up in more enlightened times, you tend to view things differently, right? So I think there are very important generational differences, and I'd love to know how all the directors of the GOT scene were too. I think that, George is also, he's of his time, right? So not that excuses it, but it does give context to why he might have written it and thought it was completely obvious. I thought it was halfway obvious because I'm 20 years younger than him, and Casey, 15 or so years younger, thinks it's obviously rape because we're so differently sensitized and educated and grew up in a totally different intellectual environment on these issues.
There's one important one. I remember that there was another Jaime. It's when Cersei was with Jaime in the Kingsgrave Tower, right? And I found it, and it's basically like the reverse of it. Okay?
Which book is this in, Nadia? Because my mind's like a sieve.
It's the same book. It's the same book. I think it's Jaime 10.
So coming up soon. Okay.
Or Jaime 9, I think. It's Jaime 9.
Do you want to read us the relevant bit?
It's actually kind of slightly longer. This is Cersei saying, "Does it matter?" She's telling Jaime that Tywin wants her to marry someone else. And Jaime asks her who wants her to marry to, and she says, "Does it matter? Some lord or the other. Someone for other things you need. I don't care. I will not have another husband. You are the only man I want in my bed ever again." Then tell him that. She pulled her hands away. "You are talking madness again. Would you have us stripped apart as mother did that time she caught us laying? Tommen would lose the throne, Myrcella her marriage. I want to be your wife. We belong to each other, but it can never be, Jaime. We are brother and sister." So Jaime says the Targaryens, and Cersei says we are not Targaryens. So he says, "Quiet, so loud you'll break my sworn brothers. We can't have that now, can we? People might learn that you had come see me." And Jaime, she sobbed, "Don't you think I want it as much as you do? It makes no matter who they wed me to. I want you at my side. I want you in my bed. I want you inside me. Nothing has changed between us. Let me prove it to you." She pushed up his tunic and began to fumble with the laces of his breeches. Jaime felt himself responding. "No," he said, "not here." They had never done it in the White Sword Tower, much less in the Lord Commander chambers. "Cersei, this is not the place. You took me in the sept. This is no different." She drew out his cock and bent her head over. Jaime pushed her away with the stump of his right hand. "No, not here," I said. He forced himself down. This is basically, and then Cersei gets really angry after this. She says, "Was it your hand they hacked off in Harrenhal or your manhood?" So basically, this is something that is sacred to Jaime, right? She tries to start it the same way that Jaime started. But then Jaime doesn't allow it. Whereas I feel like Cersei was in the sept, and the sept, even though she was scared, I don't know if scared or not, she really didn't want the Septons or anyone to find out. But the sept wasn't really sacred to her.
Maybe not.
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because does it mean that this is just further evidence that they have this dynamic of refusing consent but really giving it? Or does it just mean that Jaime raped her and now she's raped him?
Well, she didn't. Jaime didn't let her.
Yeah, I know, but that was the intention. It's also complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was like, she says, "You took me in the sept. This is no different."
Yeah.
So are you saying that that's the evidence that it is rape because she's saying that you took me against my will, so now I'm going to take you against your will? So maybe
That's just it. It's you read one sentence and you think, oh yeah, this is definitely rape, and then you read next sentence, it's like maybe not.
Yes,
And it's
Nadia, I
just
just wanted to say I felt
sorry.
the exact same thing. Like it goes sentence
Exactly
for
right.
sentence.
You can't make it. You can't pass judgment because yes, in our society, this would definitely qualify as rape, right? But in the context of this story, these particular characters, Cersei and Jaime have such a messed up relationship. It's so hard to understand what's normal for them, like because it's nothing that we would define as normal, right?
I read this, and now I'm gonna get into how I felt when I read it, and it's changed mainly because of the series, because it pointed it out to me. But the way I read it when I read it for the very first time, these two chapters sort of went together. It sort of for me showed how Jaime finally got control over his own life. He chose something for himself without being influenced by anyone else. And that was the most important thing about this. I also saw that the sex in the set was clearly an indication of a toxic relationship that needed to stop, which he basically also is realizing in my mind at least. So yeah, so I was thinking that the scene in the sept was wrong or felt wrong, but not as necessarily as rape, but it just felt wrong. And then when she then tries to, get into this, she in the Tower of the White Cloaks, he finally breaks it off, and I think that's I think that's for me that was
Significant.
what I focused on at least.
No, that's a really good point, actually. Yeah, okay. So I think we've probably gone through our reactions in the text and the line by lines and the treachery of that. And I think Casey makes a really powerful and important point about just being very basic and clear about what the text says. And I think
I want to clarify just one thing that I was saying. Like, Cersei still has her autonomy and like what she wants to do with this, I guess. Like, I don't want to like be like there has to be like, Cersei has to point it out or whatever. Like, I feel like you just need to take the text for what it is.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I was trying to say, but I was probably misrepresenting you horribly.
No, you're good.
And I think it is probably worth, again, restating, not to be too precious about it, but you almost can't be, to just reiterate what we said at the start of the show, which is, we're talking about ambiguity and the rights, not the rights and wrongs, but the sort of what can and can't be interpreted clearly in real life. You have to seek consent and you have to be sure before proceeding, and you've got to be open to listening to what your partner's saying, right? That's genuine VOK PSA. Please don't interpret our discussion of ambiguity as meaning that ambiguity is okay in real life. Sorry, that was a bit heavy. Michal, should we start bringing this out and going more meta and talking about sort of other stuff rather than the specifics of line-by-line text readings?
Yeah, I mean, my main point that I wanted to make is that, like, it is interesting to me a lot of the time we read George's work in depth like this, and on a textual level. And I know I said earlier that George didn't write the scene very well. But then I was also thinking that, like, there's a scene in Henry V where, like, I think it's between Hotspur and his wife, and Henry V won, and she's like saying absolutely not, I hate you so much, whatever, and he's kissing her, and I read that as an actually very romantic scene, with her, like, with a lot of passion between them and kind of a coy behavior. And I was thinking that, like, I can't decide actually if it's a good thing or a bad thing that you can read this both ways. Like, on the one hand, I'm like, George, be a little clearer. On the other hand, is it very smart writing that we can't figure out exactly what's going on? Like, sometimes, usually the older a story is, the more we're like, this is excellent. We have no idea what's happening here. So to me, I think, and it is also worth noting that it was written in 2000 or 90, the very late 90s, when the series hadn't taken off the way it has now. I think it's really easy to forget that George's audience was a lot smaller, still significant, but a lot smaller than it is now. And he might not have even come close to imagining that people would read his books in this way. I mean, like, I think R+L=J is a good example of that. Like, to me, he never expected people to, like, go through and catalog every single thing that somebody says. He just expected us to read this as a holistic experience, come to theories if we wanted to, and then go from there. So I think it's important to keep in mind maybe the way it was intended to be read along with all of the other millions of things that we have to keep in mind when we're reading.
Oh yeah, this is multi-layered and difficult. I'm conscious that we can talk about this and the issues around it for so long. Is there a desire to talk about the controversy in the fandom and why it's hard potentially to even talk about this as something that's open for interpretation? Or would you all rather go on to the other things? I mean, there's other important plot beats in this chapter, right? The choice that Tywin enforces on Jaime and his rejection of it is very important to discuss. But would you like to get into sort of a meta discussion of the difficulty of even having the discussion we just had and the sensitivities around it before we do that? I'm happy either way.
I'd like to say something briefly on that line.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Maybe it'll end up not being that brief, but
go for it.
I come from this from a perspective where, it's potentially problematic that we could be questioning that this scene is, not rape. But I also think that, this is a really good conversation to have. And I feel like, in most spaces, you can't have this kind of a conversation without it getting heated and, without people getting very personal about it, without people getting very uncomfortable. And I'm speaking just for myself here, but I'm glad that we're having this conversation because I feel like, that people don't talk about this calmly in other spaces. And also it's just very difficult. And I'm glad that we're able to show other opinions and, maybe be able to change some opinions. And that's of course my goal to show you guys why I think that this is the way it is. But, I think it's important to show that not everybody's always on the same page of things.
Literally in this case.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's the main thing too, is that you're right. Some places you can't have a conversation even a lot tamer than something like this without it, immediately going to flame on, right? So.
It shows me the value of reading in a community actually, and part of it is the community helps you solve the puzzles and the conspiracy theories. But far more importantly, my view on this chapter has massively been informed by being part of this community and by the reactions to the TV show and the reactions recently when we discussed how we were going to talk about this on this podcast. And the way in which I've read it has changed. Not 180 degrees, but it has changed to become more nuanced and hopefully more sensitive. So I think there's huge value in not reading and living in a bubble, especially in the current climate. So yeah, I'm hugely grateful. And I really hope that for those people listening for whom this has been a difficult discussion, even by its very nature of being discussed and debated, as opposed to just accepted, will hopefully appreciate that it was done with good intentions on everybody's part. We are trying to sort of have a very open and honest debate here.
Yeah. And I should also say, this, for me personally, this isn't talking about this doesn't hit a personal, boundary or trigger or anything like that, but for other people it might. And I respect that, people might think that we're doing the wrong thing here. And I think that, I feel like it's valid to evaluate how we're, putting this out in public and how it could be perceived. But I'm also on the same note, as I said before, happy that I can have this discussion because I think there are reasons, not just outside of the text, I think there's good reasons why we need to talk about this, because obviously I think that there's a bigger problem here with as far as actors and how D&D presented the show and how even George talks about it, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially given this is one of the most popular shows of all time. So never mind how we talk about something, how it presents something is going to be hugely influential. And, one wouldn't want it enabling or sort of giving people the wrong impression about what's permissible in a consensual relationship. So it's rightly hugely sensitive. I agree.
Yeah, I just think it should also be said that none of us here, well, okay, I don't, my goal here is to discuss fiction, I don't feel beholden by anything I've said about this situation to as my feelings on, consent between actual human living people, and I think that's also important to keep in mind that this is not approached as personally by everyone, and it's totally valid to approach it personally. That's a great and important way that people use fiction, but it's not the only way.
So there's also, you just kind of brushed into that, Michal, the whole, this is my reason why I think this is possible to discuss in this way. Yes, there's a whole community, and we trust in each other to have like respect for each other's opinions. That's very important for a discussion like this. But also, this is a fictional setting, and if we would have any real life equivalent to this, there would have been a very different discussion, because first of all, then we would have to take it into like our society and the problems in our specific society, where we can, in this sense, we can say, well, this is a made up world and we can leave it there if we want to. There's no one is forcing you to live in this misogynistic world, basically.
Yeah.
So I think that's very important also.
I almost feel like it's a separate podcast, but one I'd really enjoy listening to, that actually talked about that issue, which is how do things that are hugely popular, like Game of Thrones and other shows like Westworld, I think is very interesting and problematic in how it deals with violence against women. How do those shows impact the cultural climate? And I think that would be really fascinating. Like when we did the Gamergate podcast, hard to tackle, but I'd love to listen to that. But I do think that is a sort of a slightly different podcast to the text-based one that we've tried to do today. Any other comments on this aspect of this chapter before we move on to the other issues and beats that are in it? I don't want to cut anyone off. No? All good? Well, thank you so much for that discussion. And to the listeners, everyone's always welcome to comment on stuff on the forums of a podcast of Ice and Fire, but we'd really, if you feel we haven't tackled something the right way or whatever, please feel free to comment, because we really have spent more time than most on trying to deal with how we talk about this bit of the chapter. So really happy to hear feedback, good or bad. Okay, but there are other big things that happen in this chapter that need some discussion. Sorry.
Just about this in the scene, there was something other than the text part. Cersei mentioned like at least twice or thrice that she has Sansa's maid locked in a tower, and she has to go and question them.
Yes.
And I just like I read this chapter before, and I've just kind of like thrown past that. And then I realized, wait, Shay is one of Sansa's maids. Is this like when Cersei finds out that Shay is Tyrion's whore? Or like,
oh, really?
Cersei should have arrested.
I did think that.
Yeah, and I never noticed that before, but in the she mentions it in like quick succession, like at least 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, also Tywin mentions it right after also that they have the maids as well. So it's like hammered through that if we were noticing this stuff, we were looking for this stuff, we would have noticed that probably Shay is going to be questioned now and probably going to spill the beans.
Yeah. I never noticed that before.
No, I didn't either.
That's a really great spot because I still didn't notice it. The other kind of like big beats that happen in this chapter are Brienne getting locked up by Jaime, presumably for her own safety. And I think the Jaime-Tywin conversation obviously is very interesting. And then Jaime's delusional plans to marry Cersei.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone wants to pick one of those and go, but they're all very fascinating.
I'll go with the Brienne.
Delusional.
I'll go with the Brienne thing. I think this is kind of one of the things where he shows that him and Tyrion are not that different actually. In a way, Tyrion also makes unilateral decisions on others' behalves, which is also one of the things that makes him widely unpopular with everyone. Because under the siege, he burned all the houses in up against the wall and everything like that. He did a lot of things like that. And that's basically what turned the people against him. So I'm thinking this kind of thing where he knows he is not going to be the popular choice from the people he actually cares about, but it's the best of it's the lesser of 2 evils basically for him, and that's what I felt like there was a connection between him and Tyrion, or maybe one of the first ones really. Anyone else having an idea about that?
No, I want a song, Under the Siege.
Under the siege.
And now we got another bumper.
Now Varys is going to be down there under the siege.
So Pod is then the fish, right? That's for sure.
Yeah.
No matter however you put in the characters in the constellation of the mermaid, Pod will always be the fish in that.
What about when the blackfish is under the siege?
Oh. Oh.
Darling, it's better down where it's wetter.
Oh my.
Not from
Careful.
the flesh.
Oh
Know anything
boy.
about that?
Do we have other stuff to say on this Jaime chapter?
It's a really great scene that, well, not a scene, but I always notice it, and it's such a small thing, but I always laugh at it. It's where Brienne is being challenged by Loras, and Loras is saying, "You did murder him," and Brienne is just saying, "No, it was the shadow," or no, it was Loras says something like, "Oh, it was only yourself and Catelyn in that room. Are you saying that older women killed Renly?" And just at the thought of Loras thinking of Catelyn as old when she's like 32, that always makes me
Yeah.
laugh.
The best one is just when Jaime just verbally bitch slaps him. It's like, sit back down, boy. If this girl goes after you, you're not gonna get up for like months. She could take you with
What
a left
about
hand.
what about the whole thing of Tom and squiring?
Oh
Like
yeah, I
nothing
felt,
comes of
thought
that.
that was weird.
Yeah, Tywin wants him out of King's Landing, obviously, and away from Cersei.
Because he rightfully realizes like maybe a little distance is going to be a good idea.
Yeah.
I did
Also, he's planning to marry Cersei off, right? So
Right,
sending
right.
her away.
But also the reference when he meets the Kettle Black. I have the honor of being Sir Kettle Black or something like that. How does that qualify as an honor? He replied.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
that is
So-
totally Tyrion right there.
Yeah, the Lannisters are all great stand-up comics.
That is one thing. The plan to marry Cersei off, which he's always talking about marrying her off. Like, do you think she ever really would have allowed that? Like here, it seems like she's like, whatever. But like, would she? What length would she have gone to? I mean, do you think she would have killed Tywin? Like, I
think she would have
that
poisoned
doesn't seem like
people,
her
yeah.
thing,
I think she had
she
such
just
a
would have killed off the
horrific.
suitors.
She had such a horrific, abusive marriage that I think she would have stopped at nothing to not be married. Have I got the knots the right way around? You know what I mean.
You're like, I want a 10-year engagement, a long engagement.
Unless it was someone powerful who she felt she could manipulate. If she felt she could have a marriage entirely on her own terms, where she could utterly control that person via sex and get what she wanted out of it, maybe she might have agreed.
Well, it's very interesting to me that Jaime and Cersei kind of act differently in that. Like we have Cersei, I think in Clash, kind of like almost throwing a tantrum, or maybe earlier in this book about like Tywin's like, "You're gonna get married," and she's like, "No, I'm not," and he's like, "Yes, you are." And that's really all that's said about it. And then Jaime, like, Tywin's like, "Okay, so I want you to marry Marjorie, and like you have to have kids now," and he's like, "Absolutely not." But he comes at it from a much stronger position for some reason. Like Tywin backs off when Jaime kind of goes nuclear in their relationship, even though he doesn't think that he's doing that.
Well, because Tywin has like kind of like the right of property almost over Cersei in their society. I mean, maybe not now that she's been the queen and all that, but I mean that's sort of how the women are treated. Like certainly, other than being the father and saying, "Hey, Jaime, this is how it is," he doesn't have any I guess standing to force anything other than manipulating his son, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's already become a Kingsguard and sort of detached himself from the family.
Yeah, because societal bonds, I guess, are on. They're against him for Jaime, and they're for him for Cersei.
Yeah,
right.
One other thing I did want to note is that it's very interesting to me that Cersei and Tywin both have bizarre responses to Jaime's hand, and by that I mean like when he shows Cersei, she goes the Starks, and then Tywin's is even dumber, which he says, hang on, I'm scrolling through my illegal PDF. I think he says like, "If Catelyn Stark thinks," and that's just like a colossally stupid thing to say, isn't it? Like,
say that
but
again?
that's the assumption they would make, right? He was.
But why thinks? Tywin knows that they've all been murdered. Yeah.
Right.
Who did this? If Lady Catelyn thinks, and then it's like, dude, you just had her killed. Like, do you not remember that?
Or well, she wasn't supposed to be killed, right? She was going to be captured, and then
I don't think he really
forced
cared
the
either way,
hand,
though. I mean, like, I don't.
Right.
Yeah, but
He
at this
knows she's
point
dead at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I
it's
didn't
a small
notice
thing.
that.
It just like struck me like a very like almost like the Lannisters are so in this mode of like we have to have an enemy, and that's the Starks, and like they're almost. I don't know. They're like I think they're all maybe subconsciously aware that their actual enemies at this point are now internal, and the most dangerous things are going to come from within the walls of King's Landing, not without. So I don't know.
Or Tywin made a timeline or George made a timeline mistake.
Yeah.
But no, that couldn't happen because he doesn't
no.
make mistakes.
Those hips are childbearing hips, for sure.
Sure. I mean, we also get a foreshadowing for Oathkeeper, right? It's like, I want to give you something. No, not right now, Daddy. And it's like, okay.
I don't want your present.
Oh yeah, that's how I read it.
Yeah. So, sweetie, I have like a present for you. And I'm like, no, Daddy, not now.
It's a
There's like
BMW. I
all
wanted a
2008
Mercedes.
YouTube videos I've ever watched.
Yeah. So yeah, that's how I read it basically. And well, I didn't actually notice it on the first read, but now that I know that he was giving him Oathkeeper, that was kind of fun to think. Just like, okay, so I want to give you this, and either maybe thinking meta level, maybe George like just changed his mind. I was like, well, we can actually do a foreshadowing instead. Or it was just a foreshadowing. Maybe he changed his mind. He was like, okay, I want to give him now, but no, it would be better if it were later. Or it was just a foreshadowing, but I like to think that it was like, maybe not now. Okay, so we'll just leave it in and it's be like a almost present. I don't know. I'm rambling.
I mean, this chapter just seems like Jaime's very angry, and when he does come to meet with Tywin, he like, I think he like literally says, no, 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 no.
Yeah, he does.
And like, I feel like Jaime's just like he wanted to be home so bad, and like now he like, it feels like he really doesn't after that. But
I don't know. I think it's basically the same thing where you've been through traumatic experience, and not before you like get close to your family again. You sort of break truly, and I think that's one of the things. Or maybe you do break once, but you're not allowed, or you might break again when you like get back. And he's like, he must be frayed like emotionally, and now first really able to like blow up again. About all the things that happened to him. Yeah, that's my point. That's why I think he's just acting out because he had a bad experience on the road.
Okay. Anything else on the chapter? Okay. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up the episode. We will cover the Arya 12 chapter in the next episode of the linear reread because we've, I think with merit and justifiably gone on pretty long on the two chapters we've discussed. There's a lot there and a lot to discuss that's been worth going over with patience. For those of you who are following along at home, the next episode of the reread will therefore cover Arya 12, Sansa 6 and Jaime 8 from Storm of Swords. And it's going to be hosted by Sarah Lady Weaver, so hopefully we'll get some crackens on that with the time scheduling. We also get in that Sansa arriving in the Fingers, which is like a pretty cool step forward in the plot. So it remains for me to say thank you very much for listening. If you want to get more VOK loveliness, you can follow us along on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, iTunes, WordPress, just by searching for Vassals of Kingsgrave. But if you want to discuss what we've been talking about today and get more involved in the community, you can join the forums of A Podcast of Ice and Fire. So I just want to thank everyone for joining. I know that I've been Bina 007. Glen DagosRivers has just had to leave because his phone's dying. But thank you also to Adam, Casey, Michal, Nadia and Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
And then maybe just to wrap up by asking if you've got any forthcoming VOK episodes you want to shout out.
If you haven't if you haven't listened to the Stranger Things podcast, listen to that. And I'm sure we're gonna have more goodness coming out soon, as Patrick's gonna say.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. We are having I'm in the midst of editing a First Impressions podcast where we've watched the first 4. And there's another Dane on this one, actually a person that I know that decided to join the podcast. So more Danish goodness also.
Yay, cool.
Yeah, we are working on a Star Wars: The Force Awakens commentary track, but it's really hard to schedule.
So much
everyone.
excitement.
I know. I'm really excited.
Pew, pew.
Yeah, you sound
wanted-
excited, Michal.
I'm just like tired and
I'm so
hungry.
excited.
Oh my god, I met SJ Lee. Have I told you all this?
Yes, tell me,
Yes.
tell us.
I saw a very cute picture. It was so cute.
You saw a picture.
I saw a picture.
SJ Lee is just as lovely and intelligent and articulate and fascinating and interesting and gorgeous as you would imagine from listening to him on VOK.
Oh.
He was just fantastic. It was just like, it was only like a couple of hours, but he came all the way into central Toronto because I had a couple of hours to kill. And it was fantastic.
You wore a suit.
You wore a suit. Oh my god, that's so cute.
Oh no.
Hey Patrick, how's it going?
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, he
Also,
also brought me, like, how thoughtful of this. He brought me maple syrup and maple butter, but in a small
Oh,
enough
I mean,
size that, because I was on business travel, that I could take it in under the 100 ml,
The maple cookies.
the size thing that you can take on
Oh.
airplanes. And then I went through the airplane to go from Toronto to Montreal, and the security guy was nearly going to confiscate it because although it was under 100 ml, it didn't say it was like what the size was. So I was having to like plead with this, well, whatever the Canadian version of TSA is, like, please don't confiscate this. My friend bought it for me, and it's specifically under 100 ml. But yeah,
Sabina, somebody in Canada would have walked up to you and given it to you.
Yeah.
I think they just have to do that.
No,
Sure.
she's around here, eh? She needs the syrup. Why
Yeah.
doesn't she have the syrup?
oh my goodness.
Syrup.
American moots are the only moots I've ever experienced where we don't talk about the books, but like all other moots in the world, we just talk about text. And that's what SJD and I were doing. We were talking about characters that we think of differently to the mainstream fandom. Like, we don't think Tywin's that smart, or people that we think are kind of good when other people think they're bad, and that sort of stuff. Like, we did talk about text, and that was really fun. Cool. Well, I think that's about it for today. Posse out. Thanks all for being willing to discuss such a sensitive topic and doing it with such candor and sensitivity. It's been really a pleasure. I was really dreading doing this, but it's been an absolute pleasure. Okay, well, have a lovely rest of the weekend, guys, and thank you so much for joining.